All right, so obviously, as long as there's been art, there's been a question of censorship. Uh-oh, the buck-naked David from Michelangelo, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. He used words that people didn't like. Hell, I'll never forget the day I bought GNR's Appetite for Destruction and saw my first ever parental advisory sticker. But that is censorship for art that already exists. Let's go back to the beginning, and there's a new controversy, and it's happening right here in Canada. It is called Bill C-10, and if it's passed, critics say it could destroy the creative freedom of film and TV in our country. So here's how things work in Canada at the moment. Most of this production actually gets made by federal tax credits. And of course, that money comes from, well, you, the taxpayer. Without that tax credit, filmmakers say, you know, things like Adam Agoin's Exotica or Cronenberg's Crash or The Boys of St. Vincent, well, they would have been almost impossible to make. So how would Bill C-10 change it? Well, if it passes, the Heritage Minister, and we all know they do what the Prime Minister says, could deny tax credits to any film that's considered contrary to public policy. Basically, that's a fancy way of saying the film is offensive to the government, so no funding. So anything labeled too violent, too sexual, or too risque won't get made. Now, obviously, Canada's film and television community not that happy with it.
It cannot pass. I don't think that if Canadians knew that this was going on, that they would want it to pass.
But you know who is? This guy, Evangelical Minister Charles McVety.
This is not censorship. Filmmakers can make whatever films they want to.
He's the head of the Canadian Family Action Coalition, and you know what? Some have even suggested he's the guy behind Bill C-10. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Charles McVety. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
So, you were, I mean, like most people, we saw us in the Globe and Mail. Are you the guy behind this?
Well, for a number of years, as president of Canada Family Action Coalition, we brought forward the issue that the Canadian government is funding grossly offensive films. So, yes, we alerted the government to it, but we didn't have a traditional campaign like on raising the age of sexual consent to 16. We brought forward 750,000 names on that petition. We didn't do that on this. All we did was bring this to light, and the Liberals years ago actually drafted the legislation.
This is Liberal Party language, right?
It is. They put it in because they didn't want a movie about Carla Homolka to be funded by the Canadian government, and the Canadian people don't want their taxpayers' dollars going to movies like Young People Effing or the latest movie, The Masturbators, not to be funded by the government.
Wait, but I mean, where do you get those numbers that say most people don't want that? And first of all, have you even seen Young People Effing? Have you guys seen this movie?
I've seen clips of it. I've seen enough of it.
Wait a minute. That's like saying I read the part in the Bible where they killed a guy, and then that explained the whole thing.
Well, you know, if you've got an offensive film and you see parts that are offensive, you don't need to see the entire thing.
What about context? I mean, a scene that comes before or after, you can't base it on the title.
You know, the whole film is about the sexual escapades of 4 different couples, including orgies. This should not be funded by the Canadian government. It's obviously offensive, and not many people would support money going to this.
I'll give you that.
Taxpayer money.
I'm sure there are a lot of people that would be offended by it,
sure.
But I'm sure there are lots of people that are not offended by it, and it's just art.
Sure.
So who gets to determine what's offensive and what's not?
Well, we're not talking about censorship, because we're saying that they can make their movies on their own dime, but the government should not have to pay for it.
But realistically speaking, in this country, if there's not funding, a lot of these projects don't get made.
Well, maybe that'd be a better thing, because unfortunately Canadian films only make up 1.7% of the Canadian box office.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, though. It has nothing to do with the quality of the film. The films are great. That's why they get recognized around the world.
Well, if they'd be recognized, then they'd make more money.
That's not true.
First of all, that's why people go to the films.
That's a much more complicated discussion that neither you or I are an expert on.
Okay, but if they weren't as offensive, then they would be better recognized and more people would watch it. So I think this will actually help
Charles,
the film industry.
Charles, that's not true. You know that. You know that there's a lot more to why a film gets attention. My question is, who gets to determine what's offensive?
Well, I think the Heritage Minister has put forward a very good solution. A broad cross-section of Canadians would make up a committee, and they would decide if something was grossly offensive. We're not talking about mild offense. We're talking about grossly offensive material.
And so, now, Young People Effing is just people having sex. That's not offensive. People have sex.
Well, it's offensive. The government should not be funding it. In fact, since the inception of funding films, they've had a rule that they should not fund pornography. And that has been there, but it's not been enforced because there's no mechanism. And this little line in the Income Tax Act will then give the government that mechanism.
Right, but is it, I mean, you leave it up to the Heritage Minister, you leave it up to the Prime Minister, then every time we get a new leader or a new Heritage Minister, it's a completely inconsistent thing.
But that's democracy. That's why we elect these people.
That's dictatorship when the government tells you what you can watch.
That's
not a democracy.
It's when the government tells you what can be funded.
Or let me ask you this
Not what you can watch. You're free to watch whatever you want.
But does this apply to documentaries? Documentaries with controversial subjects?
No, they don't fund documentaries.
But there's lots of documentaries get funding from all kinds of places.
I'm sorry. On telefilm, they don't fund it, but tax credits, they do get funding.
Should documentaries get funding even if they deal with offensive material?
Well, not dealing with offensive material, but glorify. You wouldn't want hate films, like KKK films, be funded by the Canadian government.
Right, but we have a criminal code, which means that protects us. Like that isn't. We already have a criminal code that makes sure that those kinds of films don't get funded, and what does get funded is just...
but I just came from a meeting with the head of B'nai B'rith, and the criminal code doesn't always get fully enforced.
When was the last time Canadian taxpayer dollars funded a hate film?
Well, we're talking about funding films that are offensive. I don't know what films, but the whole reason for this was not to fund something like the Karla Homolka film that was about to be made. And there are films that should not be paid for by the taxpayer dollars. And all this will do is give the government that option to fund it or not fund it.
But okay, the Karla Homolka thing is a real-life, true event. So lots of films are made. Should we not make a movie about World War II? Because the Holocaust was a horrific event. Should they have never made a movie like they did in Germany called Fallen about Hitler's last days? According to this system, the government wouldn't have to fund a movie that talks about history.
Well, no, it's just that it wouldn't have to fund something that is grossly offensive. That's the issue.
Just this panel of, like, people?
Well, actually, the regulations have been there from day one. And on CBC, you have regulations. There are broadcast standards. Everybody has to live by standards.
Right.
And we should not just have an open season where you can make a film on anything and then expect the taxpayer to fund it.
Right, but some of the films people are talking about, films like Exotica, there's nothing wrong with that. Cronenberg's Cronenberg's Crash, there's nothing wrong with that.
This would not affect 99% of the films made. It would only affect those grossly offensive films.
Which, if there was a way to ensure that, I guess that would be fine. The problem is nobody trusts any government to do this properly.
And that's why we have elections. We
have a censor
elect
board
good
that already does this. We have a censor board that always, like, we make the films, because here's what I think about this bill. It's afraid of ideas, in that the government tells you what they think they're comfortable with, and so you then don't ever get a chance to see this film because it never got made. You have a censor board that makes these films, makes these TV shows, rates them. You then can make the decision if you want to watch it. Maybe you want to watch it later in your life.
I'm a conservative. I don't believe in censorship. I believe that the government should properly spend their money on good projects, but if somebody wants to make a film on their own nickel, they can go ahead and do it, and then people can watch whatever films they want to watch.
Yeah, but I think the problem isn't the government, when you leave it in the hands of the Prime Minister and the Heritage Minister to determine what people get to watch, that you think that's that is censorship?
Well, no, because it's not about what they watch.
It's a clever kind of censorship.
No, it's about what they fund, and we elect these people to spend our billions of dollars on good projects, and they're the homeless that are out there that need money. Our healthcare system needs money. Education needs money, and young people effing doesn't need money.
You haven't seen the film. You can't say that.
I've seen parts of it.
You can't blame on the trailer. Like I said, that's like reading one verse in the Bible and then summing up the whole Bible. You can't do that.
If you have a movie about child pornography, you don't have to watch the whole thing. You can see parts of it and then away it goes.
This is not that. You know that.
That's why this clause must be in the Income Tax Act.
Here's the thing. That's another story, how they sneak it in and nobody even knows what's going on, but there should have been a debate on this. My question to you is this. Until you got the credit in the Globe and Mail for doing this would have slipped under the radar. And now all of a sudden it's coming back.
Well, let me correct that a bit, because it was on the front page of the Globe and Mail a day before they even phoned me.
But not until your name went there did it become the thing.
I did not spill the beans on this.
No.
This was an issue, and then the Globe and Mail interviewed me about it. And yes, now the Senate, the Liberal-appointed Senate, is promising to override the democratically elected decision and and quash this clause, and I hope it doesn't happen. I hope it goes through, and I hope that government, good government, practices the disbursement of our taxpayers' funds in a responsible way.
Right, and so this is what it boils down to, right? Is taxpayer money being spent in a way that reflects the values of taxpayers, right?
That's right.
Right, so then, and I pose this to you in a very serious manner. There are an awful lot of people in this country who are not religious at all and who have a problem with the fact that churches get tax breaks and that churches don't have to pay taxes on their property. You know, and all those things. Catholic schools get funding. Should all religion not get funding? Because that offends a lot of people that we know who aren't religious at all. So is that a waste of money? Should churches be forced to be, should government be responsible with churches the way they're with everything else?
There's no consensus in Canada that religion should not receive any funding. There's no consensus in this country that we should not get tax breaks for religious properties.
There's no consensus in this country about this bill either, because it never went to debate.
I think there's a consensus in this country that dirty movies should not be funded by the taxpayer.
Well, but what's a dirty movie, Charles?
Well,
Charles?
That's
Charles, come back again. Let's keep talking about this, okay?
That's what people have to decide.
All right, we'll come back.
George.
We'll talk more. Charles McVety, everybody. All right, stick around. Up next, one of the masters of political satire.